Dr. Justin Sledge, thank you so much for being willing to come onto my channel yet again. Now, I kind of imagine that most people who are watching this know who you are. I think there's a big overlap between our audiences, but just for the people who are seeing you for the first time, can you introduce yourself and what your channel is about?
Yeah, thanks for having me, man. It's good to be back on. Hi, folks. My name is Justin Sledge, Doctor of Justin Sledge, if that matters. I'm an academic working in the study of Western Esotericism, which is all of the kinky religious study stuff, magic and alchemy, Kabbalah, witchcraft, the occult in general. And I primarily work in the pre-modern world, but my channel Esoterica, which is a YouTube channel you can check out. We do academic explorations of topics and the history of Western esotericism. So I think the next episode I'm working on now is how occultism came to the United States, the colonies actually, who were the first occultists in the American colonies. And it turns out, surprise, surprise, it was the Puritans. We think of the Puritans as not, going loggerheads with occultism, but it turns out there were a couple of Puritan occultists. As much as that sounds like a contradiction, but history doesn't really care about our categories, and so we'll be exploring an early colonial Puritan occultist.
Okay, so you uploaded a video over a year ago now that for my wife and I was very shocking. We're both very into your channel and this kind of genre of content in general. This video is titled How Ancient Apocalyptic Jewish Ascent Esotericism Laid the Foundations of Christianity.
Wow,
now,
what a
we'll
title,
get
right?
into ideas that you discussed there.
Yeah, how not to get picked up by the algorithm.
Well, the video did pretty well.
It did okay.
I would say, it seemed to do well, I think. But yeah, we'll get into the ideas that you discuss in there in more specific terms in a bit. But I just want to know, first of all, what motivated you to make that video?
I see a lot of content on the internet just about the origins of Christianity, and it just seems like everybody has a piece of the pie when it comes to the origins of Christianity. And one of the pieces of that pie that always struck me as conspicuously missing is this business we'll talk about, I'm sure, of Merkavah mysticism, this form of Jewish mystical ascent or descent practices, as we'll talk about. And it just seems like that Paul had some access to this. And that always struck me as a very conspicuous aspect of the history of Christianity, insofar as Christianity is, at least the Christianity that survives is essentially a Pauline movement. And insofar as Paul seems to have connections to this sort of apocalyptic mysticism that was endemic in at least some aspects of Judaism, that just struck me as an important part of that equation that I had not heard talked about. And so, it was like a chance just to kind of like, I was a weird guy in the back raising my hand being like, what about this? And then a lot of people turned out that they were like, what in the world are you talking about? But again, I didn't pioneer any of that. That's all, people like James Tabor and Siegel and other scholars who come long before me. But I remember being an undergrad thinking this stuff and finding that Tabor had written a book about it, and his dissertation, in fact. And, feeling, I'm sure you've had the moment where you like get to feel not crazy, realizing that other scholars or someone has come up with similar lines of thinking. So I had that I'm not crazy moment, or at least I'm crazy the way that other people are crazy. And so that was a fun one. But yeah, it was just sort of throwing my hat in to say, there's a dimension of the origins of Christianity, especially Pauline Christianity, that both explains some relatively weird stuff in some of Paul's writings, but also connects Christianity more broadly with the kind of Jewish mysticism that may have existed and certainly existed afterwards in that milieu.
Speaking of apocalypticism, the end is nigh for your online privacy. The dark forces of this world, aka data brokers, collect your personal information from your online activity and sell it to any wicked man who wants to know your address, phone number, or even your religious beliefs. A great plague can then befall you: spam calls, texts, emails, proselytizing, and even hikes in your health insurance premiums. But lo, a savior has come, Incogni, the sponsor of this video. This is a service that scours the internet for your personal information, rebukes the wicked, and gets it removed for you. And your faith need not be tested, for you may easily track the number of times Incogni has gotten your data out of the clutches of the forces of darkness. I can bear witness, as I have sought out the glories of Incogni and have received my due portion of their grace. They keep me from getting spammed and help me keep my personal information private. In case you didn't get that last part. So, give Incogni a try. Use code Skeptic at the link below and get 60% off an annual plan. Signing up supports my channel and protects your personal data at the same time. Okay, let's walk through that specific kind of crazy that we have both become here, just step by step. Now, what is Paul recounting in 2 Corinthians 12, 1 through 12?
Yeah, so this is a really weird section of Paul. Well, so basically what he says is he knows a guy, and this is how it begins in the third person, right? I knew a guy. And he says, I knew a guy that was caught up to the third heaven. And that's just a very peculiar thing for him to say. And then as you read that sequence through 2 Corinthians, he shifts from I knew a guy to it being very clear that guy was me. It's a weird rhetorical move that he does. And basically it comes down to the position that, the world's wisdom is all ignorant compared to what he's experienced. And that in that experience, that seems to have been the transformative moment where Paul seems to have had some kind of shocking transformation. And he recounts it as if it happened a long time ago. I forget exactly how many, 12 years ago or something like that. This moment, this thing seems to have happened. And so in that mystical experience, he seems to have met the Christ, in which he understands to be the resurrected Jesus, it seems like. And there's an argument to be made based on Acts, which again, Acts is, history is we should use that word history very loosely there. It's mostly a Roman era romance, where it seems like if we do some calculations, some math, it would seem like that might have been where he got the admonition by the resurrected Christ to preach the gospel not just to the Jews, but also to the Gentiles. And if that's true, and other people, again, have made this argument, it's not uniquely my argument. If that's true, then that mystical experience of him being caught up to the third heavens is interesting for two really important respects. One, it's interesting because we know of a Jewish form of mysticism that was practiced around that time, certainly afterwards, in which Jewish ascetic practitioners, what Dr. James Davila calls Jewish shamans, are traveling through this cycle of the Merkavah, the chariot mysticism, into these heavens, into these palaces of God, Hekhalot. And that links Paul to that form of mysticism. And secondly, and perhaps even more importantly for world history, if it's the case that this Merkavah mysticism that Paul may have been attached to is the groundwork in which he develops out of that mystical experience the idea that he should go not just to the Jews but to the Gentiles, then that is a watershed moment in human history. That means that Christianity is no longer going to be tethered as a Jewish apocalyptic movement. It's going to become a broader, at least Eastern Mediterranean, and of course worldwide apocalyptic movement. And the scholarship seems to indicate that may have been what happened. And I find the timeline relatively convincing, as much as we can trust all these moving parts. But I find it a very compelling argument, and I think it explains a lot of otherwise strange things that are going on in Paul's writings and in Paul's theology. And I think that I'm relatively convinced by this line of thinking.
Okay, so in 2 Corinthians 12, we find, this story of a vision. And also in the book of Acts, we find a story of a vision that Paul admits to having had in the temple in Jerusalem. Are we saying that this is the same vision?
Yeah, that seems to be the argument made by several scholars, that if you do some rough calculation based on sort of when things are happening, if we can trust whatever to the degree we can trust these various accountings. Again, Acts is not a terribly trustworthy piece of history, if it's history at all. Corinthians, I think, is Paul legitimately talking, being forthright, and it seems that folks like Murray have made the argument in some of their writings that it's one and the same vision, and I find that to be compelling.
So you say in your video that Paul imagines himself to have been split into a higher angelic self and a lower earthly self as a result of this vision.
Right.
Something that strikes me is elsewhere in Paul's letters, he talks pretty repeatedly about the transformation of the body in Christ. When you
the glorification of the body. Right.
When you become a follower of Christ, there's a glorification of the body. Now, does Does Paul think that faith in Christ somewhat replicates his experience that may have been grounded in Jewish mysticism?
I think so. So the language of being transformed into something like an angelic body or a glorified body, that's also a theme that we find in this Merkavah Hekhalot mysticism, where people descend into the chariot. The language is always descent, which is weird. It's Yorde Merkavah, like you go down into the chariot. We're not quite sure what that means. It may mean some kind of introspective journey or something, but it's hard to say exactly what it means. But when you go into this mystical state, you descend into various palaces of the divine world. These palaces are filled with angels that you have to know complicated passcodes for and all kinds of things. It's also worth noticing that in later Jewish traditions, the palaces, there are 7 of them. In earlier texts, there are 3. I think that's interesting that that Paul seems to have the idea that he went to the 3rd one, which would have been perhaps the highest one. And in those palaces, there are stories in this literature where people are transformed into angels. Literally, in 3rd Enoch, we have Enoch transformed into the angel Metatron. And so that's a clear case where this literature has a human being or whatever being translated into an angel. In other cases, one is transformed into a being of fire, like a seraph, and then one is able to circle around the throne, crying out, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty." So in many of this literature, once you achieve the highest state of this, you're transformed into a kind of fiery angelic being. And the fact that one, is able to go in there and see Christ having been resurrected into one of these beings is just really, it ties up to this. And furthermore, in this literature, Metatron is also referred to in one of the more exotic texts, again, 3rd Enoch. Metatron is referred to as Yahweh Katan, the little Yahweh. And the idea that a human being can be transformed into an angel or quasi-angel-like being and then referred to as a lesser Yahweh, as a kind of aspect of Yahweh, that's really difficult not to see, and this heresy, this so-called heresy, is called the Two Powers in Heaven heresy. It terrified Judaism. And the idea that at some level, this idea that there could be a human being transformed into a lesser Yahweh, a lesser God, that just seems terribly similar to what Paul's on about in his letters. So I think what's most conspicuous again here to drive home this parallel between 3rd Enoch and Paul's writing is the idea of a human being being translated into a lesser aspect of God. And it's clear that Paul clearly has that idea. He has the idea that Christ is semi-divine or divine in some kind of way. And that idea, while many people think, "Oh my God, what a shocking idea to be found in a Jewish thinker of the first century," it may have not been all that shocking. Now, it may have been equally heretical. We know of other Jews who seem to have engaged in the same kind of heresy, again, that so-called Two Powers in Heaven heresy, of which Elisha ben Abuya is the most prominent arch heretic in the Jewish tradition, at least. But it seems like that was a current that was available to Paul. And Paul seems to have used it to make sense of this experience that he had and this Merkavah, apparently Merkavah-inspired mystical experience.
All right, let's talk a little bit about Jesus here. You said in that video that Paul imagines Jesus making the same kind of mystical journey as described in Merkavah and Hekhalot literature as a way to extend the benefits of that journey to everyone who has faith in him. I think you say that it's the descent or ascent to end all descents or ascent.
Mm-hmm.
So this means that, it's not just elites that can have this kind of spiritual or mystical journey. It's everyone. The non-elite now can too. Can you talk about this a little bit?
Yeah, so some of the early literature associated with the Merkavah literature, like things like the Ascension of Isaiah, which seems to have been a very important text for early Christians, has Jesus descending down through the series of the heavens, and he eventually puts on a kind of a garb to disguise himself so the angels don't recognize him, and then he descends into the world and becomes enthroned, but in flesh rather, and then ultimately makes a reascent. And so It seems like what's happened is that Jesus has, in Paul's mind, done the reascending. He's reascended into the divine realm as a human being. And because he's reascended into the divine realm, again, much in the same way that the Merkavah mystics would have done, is that he's done it in a kind of way that has blown the gates open, so to speak. No longer do individual people have to do all this very complicated work of memorizing passcodes and learning secret handshakes and learning the complicated names of God and angels. It's that Jesus has just done it all in one go. And because Jesus has done it all in one go, one, he's received kind of not just a transformative status of becoming an angel, but he's become something like a God. He's become this, semi-divine entity. Again, a bit like Metatron. And secondly, because he's made this journey, perhaps in the process of having died and been resurrected, the journey is complete. The bridge between the human being and the divine world has now been restored in some sense, and now anyone can do it, insofar as they have trust in Jesus and they die in that trust. And that upon their death, they'll be resurrected, at least in some form, and they'll be allowed to enter into paradise with Christ. And that Paul, when he has this vision being called up to the third heaven, he kind of sees it all laid out. He sees, it's all been done. We just have to have trust, pistis, we have to have faith that Christ has done it for us. And that kind of language of you just have to have faith that he's done it. You have to have trust that he's already made the journey for you. And he's been transformed, and you'll be transformed too. In fact, you're being transformed already. Paul often uses a kind of participial form, like you're being transformed already. Some of you won't even taste death, that you'll be physically able to rise into the heavens and go on this journey. And again, to put this in a broader context, this isn't just a Jewish idea. There are a lot of people in the 2nd, 3rd centuries who are interested in theologies and technologies of ascent. This is true of Jewish mystics. This is true of Egyptian religiosity, which at that point had been extremely ancient. The idea that some aspect of us will survive our death and go into a heavenly region. We see this developing in Middle Platonism and Stoicism. That will be taken up into religions like Hermeticism. This is a pretty like ubiquitous idea. And the idea of going into the underworld and dying and being resurrected is also something you see in the Greek mysteries as well. We should forget about the Hellenistic context in which Jesus is also operating. So Paul would have had available to him a wide range of interpretive skills to figure out where Jesus lands in all of this very complicated world of so-called ascent soteriology. But I think that, again, we're only seeing it through a glass darkly. We're, to use Paul's language, we're only seeing it, based on Jewish texts that we have surviving from a couple of centuries later, in which we see the kind of things that Paul seems to have been talking about. Now, I have to be very honest here. We don't have 1st century texts that are Merkavah texts. We just don't have them. We don't have 1st century texts that tell us that this kind of mysticism was practiced. But what we do have is the visions of Ezekiel and the visions of Isaiah that seem to have been what we call proto-Merkavah or proto-apocalyptic, in which that literature may have been an early version of this literature being practiced perhaps in Babylon. It may be even derivative from some form of mysticism that existed in the first temple. And it seems like we have that literature, and then the connective tissue is this later literature where people are actually practicing some form of this mysticism. And to be clear for folks who've never read any of this mystical literature, they're talking about texts like Hekhalot Rabbati and Hekhalot Zutarti and other texts like this, the third book of Enoch. By the time we get these texts, they are incredibly complicated, which to me is evidence that they are ancient, that they've been developed over centuries and centuries and centuries. And so when we find these texts, I don't think we're finding them as they were produced in the 3rd or 4th centuries. I think we have them downstream of many centuries prior to that. And they are positively bizarre texts. Some of the most bizarre texts I think ever produced in the history of Judaism, and also some of the most appreciated and some of the least understood texts in the history of Judaism, but important enough that the rabbinical elites felt the need to deal with them and felt the need to respond to them, and so much so that one of the most important tales in this literature, the so-called Pardes journey, undertaken by four important rabbis ends up in the Talmud and is not just discussed at length, but in fact there are careful religious rules bounding who can study it and how. And this is a place where, again, I've said this many times on my channel, that when we have a prohibition, we have evidence of practice. That prohibition almost always evidence practice. You don't prohibit things people aren't doing. And to me, the fact that we have a very early example of this literature being forbidden tells me that that's a good indicator that it was being practiced.
Right. That actually really reminds me of some of the early Christian writings. I think there was something that actually made it into it was ruled on by the Council of Nicaea, talking about how, young men should not castrate themselves for Christ, or at least if you have castrated yourself out of devotion, then you shouldn't be appointed to any position of power.
Right. Yeah. So, it's probably referring to someone like Origen, right? Origen
Right.
allegedly castrated himself. I think he probably did. Again, be careful which verses you read literally. If it offends you, cut it off. He may have in fact done something just like that. Again, there's debate about whether Origen really did that or not. But like you said, the fact that they had to make a public statement on it meant that it probably, if it were Origen, it weren't just Origen.
Right, exactly. Okay, so all of this sounds pretty transgressive to someone who's familiar with what Christianity looks like today, which I think really brings me to the question of, why would Paul share this kind of mystical experience as a way to try to establish his legitimacy as an apostle? Why would he do that?
I think you just put the nail, the nail on the head, right? That Paul never met Jesus in life. He could never make that claim to fame the way that perhaps Peter or James could. They knew the guy. James was his brother. They knew him quite well. They had heard his teachings, literally sitting there with him. They'd heard him. Paul could never claim that. He was always, he was a persecutor of Christians by his own admission, assuming that he really was, but certainly he never met Jesus in real life. And insofar as his apostleship was going to have any merit, he had to have some kind of authority bestowed upon him. And if you couldn't meet him in life, well, why not meet him in death? And it seems like his claim, and I don't believe Paul's lying about this. I think that the account we get in 2 Corinthians is a legitimate story he's telling from an experience he really had. I'm not cynical when I read Paul. This is a thing that is fashionable now, is to be very cynical about Paul. Paul ruined Christianity, and Paul's the worst guy ever. Really, we need to go back to what Jesus taught and not Paul. I don't buy any of that. In fact, I think if there is any actual mystical core of early Christianity, it's Paul and not Jesus. I think that's a controversial thing to say, but I think Paul was the mystic and not Jesus. I don't see any evidence of Jesus being a mystic. But I think that the way he's establishing his authority is by saying, not only did I hear Jesus teach me things, but I heard it in heaven, and I heard it from the resurrected Christ, and I heard it without parables and stuff. And I think that's an incredible ability to claim that I have authority from not just the Jesus that was, but from the Christ who is. And that is an incredible way of establishing authority. I guess the other thing I would say about that's worth mentioning is that he's not just getting his message from Jesus, he's getting his message from God. It just so happens that Jesus is now co-God. And that very clearly establishes that you're an authentic apostle, because you're not just being minted by Jesus of Nazareth, you're being minted by Christ the God. And that's a hell of a way, to get some authority. So I think that these things are ways of doing it. And again, the only time I think that Jesus ever quotes a teaching of Jesus from life is a teaching on divorce. I think it's the only time we really get a moment where Jesus is actually quoted by Paul, where we get this sort of hardcore prohibition on divorce. In fact, Jesus is more strict than any other rabbi that I know of from that time period. No other rabbi is as conservative as Jesus when it comes to the business of divorce, which gives a lie to the idea that Jesus was hippy dippy, love everybody. He was a relatively conservative Jewish jurist. When you actually look at his legal teachings versus the rabbis around him, Jesus would have been seen as a sort of a fundamentalist of the strongest kind. Positions that never was accepted by main school rabbinical Judaism. But his authority, Paul's authority, is established by Christ as God, not by Jesus as apocalyptic preacher. And so I think that allows him a real trump card over and against the apostles that would have known Jesus face to face.
Okay, so other apostles early in Christ's ministry were also Jewish. Is there any reason to think that they might have shared some of Paul's mystical influences as well?
It's so hard to say. Paul is, so far as we can tell, relatively educated, relatively Hellenizing. Like the Greek he works in is a Hellenizing Greek. He seems to be somewhat aware of the wider Hellenistic world. He seems to be pretty aware of, he at least knows how to, he knows who to name drop. Now, did he really study under Gamaliel? I don't know, probably not. But does he know to name drop Gamaliel? He does know that. And that gives him some degree of cultural cachet and some degree of worldliness. He's not from Jerusalem. Jerusalem was a backwater in the Roman Empire. He's from Tarsus. He's from sort of Syria, which is a bit more of a headwater when it comes to at least the Eastern Mediterranean basin. So if he was connected to the rabbinical world or the para-rabbinical world, which I think is an important distinction, James DeVille and other folks have made the argument that this Hekhalot literature and this Merkavah mysticism was not developed in the rabbinical center. It was developed on the periphery of the rabbinical world, which I think makes a lot more sense for someone like Paul to be on sort of the periphery of the rabbinical world, educated in Judaism, but not really part of the establishment, and maybe even using mysticism as a way of bucking the establishment. A really important aspect of this form of mysticism is that it is a mechanism by which you can learn Jewish wisdom without having to do a bunch of studying. This is sort of a shortcut where you literally conjure an angel and the angel instructs you, or you get direct instruction from angels. And that allows you to avoid having to go to these complicated Jewish universities and study all day, And so these are people who are saying, look, we can basically short circuit all this by effectively using magic of a certain kind. And that puts them sort of at the periphery of the rabbinical world at some level. And in some sense, this form of mysticism is a protest to the kind of academic stuffiness of maybe the academic world that the rabbis were developing in. And so could it have been the case that Paul was more apt for this than Jesus's colleagues? I think the answer to that is yes, insofar as Jesus's colleagues were Galilean peasants. I mean, these were fishermen. These were guys that his brother would have not been, terribly more terribly educated than him. They were followers of an apocalyptic preacher in the form of John the Baptist. They were from the Galilee. These were craftspeople, skilled craftspeople. Again, insofar as Jesus and the cadre of people around him would, I think, not have been terribly educated and not part of the rabbinical elite or the para-rabbinical world. They'd have been very much on sort of the fringes of this as apocalyptic preachers and things like this. I think Paul's a better candidate for thinking of someone who could have had access to this mystical technology whereby one gets sort of immediate divine court. You get into the divine court and therefore get these esoteric secrets directly from the horse's mouth, so to speak.
We've touched on this, but I just want to make sure that we address this because I think it's maybe the most important question to ask here. It sounds like the fact that Paul was an elite very much contributed to the idea that he was involved with this kind of mystical tradition. It was a more elitist type tradition. But it also sounds like we maybe are saying that this mysticism contributed to his, world-changing idea of eliminating effectively the class structure between like Jews and Gentiles, elites and non-elites. How does this work? How does mysticism, this Jewish mysticism, contribute to his idea of taking the gospel to the Gentiles? Does it?
We don't know exactly, because we don't know exactly what precipitated him to make that decision. There's been a lot of debate about that historically. One argument has been that they were failing to get Jewish converts, and so Paul set out in the Eastern Mediterranean to people who were more cozy with Jewish or quasi-Jewish ideas. I think that Murray's argument, and I'm really relying on Murray's argument. We can put a link to his paper in the description if folks want to read it. That Murray argues that that basically what's happening is that the Jewish movement in Jerusalem is failing to get traction. It's a tiny movement of tens of people, probably. And for whatever reason, Paul, his more comfortable area of operating is in the Eastern Mediterranean, sort of north of there, in what is now Turkey, Anatolia. And that they're already there kind of quasi-monotheistic folks, so-called God-fearers, people that were sort of sitting in the back of synagogues or interested in this message of ethics combined with the one God stuff, and that and those people were largely Gentiles. And I think that the Murray's argument is that that Jesus' authority basically shorts the circuit. It gives Paul the authority to preach the gospel to both Jew and Gentile because Jesus has basically he's broken down the gates in terms of this access to heaven for everybody, and therefore faith in him saves everyone. And so I think that that's the idea. But again, there's speculation here. We have to be really clear here that we're engaging in a good bit of speculation. And speculation basically is that the mystical vision in 2 Corinthians is the same as the Jerusalem one. And the Jerusalem one is where immediately he begins to preach that there's no distinction between Jew and Gentile. I think that Murray makes a good argument that those two mystical visions are the same, because we don't get any other. It's not the mystical vision where on the road to Damascus or whatever. It's not that vision, and so the vision in Jerusalem seems to line up with the time period in which we can place Paul in Jerusalem, and insofar as those two things line up, and then what comes out of that is the preaching to the Gentiles, then we have good reason to believe that they're one and the same vision, and that what seems to emerge out of it is the license to preach the gospel to the Gentiles. And of course, that's immediately what Paul does. And again, Acts is not reliable history. We have to be clear about this. But I don't buy that Acts is not history at all. I don't buy that it's completely made up of whole cloth. It's a novel the same way that Harry Potter is a novel. I do think that it contains historical memory, but I think it contains historical memory in the service of legitimating a particular kind of theology, and that particular kind of theology, of course, being the theology of Paul and the developing myth of how to establish Paul as the authority within the church. Because again, we have Paul competing not just with people like James and Peter in Jerusalem, but also other people. Apollos is another great example. We have this Apollos guy who's apparently from Alexandria. He's clearly competing with Paul and Anatolia, and Paul needs to not just be able to compete with people like Apollos, but he needs to be able to compete with the Jewish followers. But I think his threats are much more people like Apollos, who are also operating as apostles in the world of sort of Anatolia there. And of course, Apollos' theology is very much wrapped up in Greek philosophy. He sees Jesus as having satisfied all kinds of characteristics, more typically of someone like Philo of Alexandria. But with Paul, you have this very clear, I'm sent on a vision vouchsafed. I'm sitting here on an apostleship vouchsafed by a mystical encounter with the resurrected Christ as God.
Okay, so final question here. I've heard you say that until about the 1980s, a lot of scholars just sidestepped this idea that Paul had a connection or practice in Jewish mysticism. Why is that? Why would people do that?
I think the principal reason, and this is again hilarious, the principal reason is they didn't have access to the texts. The Merkavah Hekhalot literature had just simply not been collected yet. Now, this sounds really weird, but there's been, and we can maybe talk more about it, but Jewish mystical texts have had a long, difficult journey to publication. And there's competing reasons for why that is, but whether it's the mystical texts of the Kabbalah, or whether it is the mystical texts of the Merkavah mysticism, Jewish mystical texts getting into print and then getting into the scholarly ecosystem has been a very slow process. Even to this day, Kabbalistic texts are overwhelmingly untranslated. And I think the watershed moment is in the early 80s. I think 1981 is when we actually have, it's not exactly a critical edition, it's what is called a synopsis. It's where we have a bunch of these texts put together side by side. They're so weird and erratic that often you can't knit them together into a critical edition the way that one would want to. But we actually have a synopsis produced in 1981 where all the Hekhalot and all the Merkavah texts are put into one volume, and then we can basically at that point translate them for the first time as a literature out of Aramaic and Hebrew and into German first, and then eventually into English. And I think that part of what happened is that this happened in the 1980s, and by the late 80s and early 90s, people like James Tabor and Murray and other folks were beginning to see, hold on, a lot of the things that we see in this early strata of Merkavah mysticism are also seemingly echoed in Paul. Paul seems to be using some of the same technical language translated obviously out of Aramaic and Hebrew, but into Greek, of heavens and glorified bodies and stuff like this. And that language is weirdly unique in some ways, not to Paul, but it seems to be echoing a lot of this other literature that again, I say we just discovered, but a lot of this has been read by Jews for centuries. And so, again, people like James Tabor and Murray and other folks began to put out publications basically saying, I think we have an answer to this, that Paul, the linchpin issue of early Christianity is not just apocalypticism, but it's some early version of this Merkavah literature. And that caused a lot of scholars to dive more deeply into this, and the realization began to be clear from studying later literature in the Talmud, that there was an entire underground current of Judaism that we now refer to as the two powers in heaven heresy. And this two powers in heaven heresy was the idea that there were two gods, that there was a lesser god and a major god being hidden, the minor god being often a transformed human being in some form, or an angel or something. And when you think about that as a homology and you study that over and against Paul, well, it lines up really well. It seems to be very similar. And so, again, Paul was a Jew, and if you want to make sense of someone, the best thing to do is put them in their context, their historical context. And the historical context was one in which Jewish people were actively inculcating visions of climbing into the heavens, and into the heavens they were seeing themselves transformed into divine-like beings, and they were seeing other beings being transformed as well. Human beings being transformed. And it all fit. And it fits strongly to my mind. Now, again, do we have all the connective tissue? Of course we don't. All we have from Paul's random letters, and all we have from the Merkavah literature are quite difficult to understand texts produced centuries later. But when we lay it all out, it'd be difficult to imagine there isn't some connection. In the same way that the Apocalypse of John, in my mind, is the most Jewish book in the entire New Testament. If we look at the Apocalypse of John in its context, it looks completely weird. It's a very bizarre text. If you look at it in the context of Greek literature, it looks very bizarre. But if you look at it in the context of Jewish literature of that time, it can stand in line, because there are 50 more texts like that. There are dozens of texts like that. And you're like, oh, the Apocalypse of John is actually the least weird text, culturally speaking, in the New Testament. And ditto with this whole weird business in 2 Corinthians where Paul's caught up to the third heaven. It sounds very strange in its out of context. But then when you literally have, this is the standard translation in English of the Merkavah literature by De Villa. Now, when you realize that that's just about as big as the New Testament, you get some sense that there's a lot of this literature. We have about 50 manuscripts of it survive. And again, 50 manuscripts of it surviving is an indicator that there was a pretty good amount of it that didn't. And so insofar as that literature is relatively extensive, we can imagine that it was, and we find evidence of it as far to the west as Egypt and as far east as examples in Babylonia. So we know that it was ubiquitous in the Jewish world, and eventually we know that it would spread as far north as Europe because the last versions of it to actually enter into the literature were redacted in the 13th century in Germany. So Jews are reading this stuff the entire time. And so I think that the idea is that if we're going to understand Paul, let's just put him into his context. And this seems to have been the context, and it all seems to, again, fit. Not a perfect story. It doesn't explain everything. But I think, like I said, it's part of the pie. How big of a part, I don't know, but it needs to just be, we should all admit that it's certainly part of the pie.
Yeah, at the end of this here, I'm just thinking that this is really a deeply mundane claim. We understand, Jesus' various apostles and the writers of various other texts in the New Testament to be a product of their environments, and so why shouldn't we see Paul as a product of the Jewish context in which he was a part?
I think part of the reason why we don't is there's some element of anti-Semitism. Like, we don't like the idea. Again, there's Christian anti-Semitism is just a thing. And the idea that many people don't want them to be Jewish. And the more Jewish they look, the more alien they are. So I think that's part of it. Also, there's a desire to see Christianity as some kind of a decisive break, not as a continuity with. That it was an outgrowth of a sort of, I won't call it deviant, but para-rabbinic form of Judaism. Of course, again, the Second Temple period is not a period in which there is a Judaism. There are Judaisms, lots of different Judaisms, and of course, Christianity grew out of the crucible of that Judaism. I think the other side of it is that there are two other things that come to mind. The second or third, I suppose, is that we don't like the idea that somehow Christianity may have its origins in a kind of non-rational experience. That there's a desire on the part of Christianity to engage in systematic theology. And despite the fact that there's an element of faith in it, the idea that it could have been born to some significant degree out of one random guy's altered state of consciousness. And, history can sometimes ride on one guy's alterations of consciousness, whether it's Muhammad hearing the angel Gabriel in a cave or whatever, Akhenaten having experience with the sun god or whatever. It just so happens that Paul may have had this experience. And something about that non-rationality, I think, also sits uncomfortably with some people. And I think that maybe the last reason I'll give is also tied up in the weird contingency of history, is that we think we figured it all out. Everyone thinks they've figured out the origins of Christianity to some degree. There's a sort of an official story that, you can accept the dogmatic story that literally Jesus appeared to Paul and it goes like that. But the idea that there are still secrets to be unpacked about the origins of Christianity, I think is alarming to some people, because one of those secrets might undermine some aspect of it. That the more we have it buttoned up, the less we have to deal with apologetically or something. And the idea that basically, again, and then most of this literature is not known about basically because of internalized anti-Semitism. This is a thing that many people may not know, that Jewish mysticism, when it was really being pioneered as an academic study, was actively suppressed by Jewish scholars. And the reason why in the early 20th century was because Jewish scholars in Germany especially were deeply concerned about anti-Semitism, as they were right to be. And the idea was, if we publish all this weird stuff, the Germans are going to think we're weird. And we don't want them to think we want them to think that we're normal German people, good Lutheran-like Jews, basically. And so they intentionally suppressed the publication of Jewish mystical literature in the hopes that the Germans would basically say, you guys are reasonable. The Talmud is a book full of arguments, and it's about logical debates over how to be good people. Good. All right. We have that too. It's canon law, or it's, church law, whatever. We're all kind of the same. Ethical monotheists. Good. And of course that didn't work. I mean, anti-Semitism didn't care at all whether, had no impact. In fact, many of those guys that did that decision converted to Christianity ultimately. And so what's happened is so much Jewish mystical literature has, because of anti-Semitism, has remained untranslated and understudied. And to your point earlier, of course, it's the most obvious point imaginable that Christianity would have its origins in some kind of mystical Judaism. The problem is that most of us don't have access to those kinds of texts. And of course, there have been major discoveries in the 20th century, like the discovery of the Cairo Geniza, and major scholastic works like the production of the synopsis of the Hekhalot literature. But I think were it not for both internalized anti-Semitism, but also for anti-Semitism in general scholarship, this would not have been a major talking point as late as the 1990s. And, blowing people's mind in YouTube videos in the 2020s. This should have been standard fare, basically, in the 1950s. But again, it shows you that scholarship is not linear, that there are all kinds of social forces that intervene in it, and that what is one day a told tale will turn out not to be all that told in the end. So again, I'm not saying this is some people have misread that video as saying, oh, all of Christianity is born out of, Merkavah mysticism. And I'm like, no, but it might be that this mystical experience that Paul had, especially if we think that if the mystical experience of 2 Corinthians is the same as the one in Jerusalem, and that one is the one that ultimately caused Paul to reach out to Jew and Gentile both, well, of course, that means that this otherwise very obscure form of Jewish mysticism has had a world historical impact in the development of Christianity outside of a very minoritarian Jewish apocalyptic sect.
Well, Justin, this has been fascinating, very illuminating. And I just want to express appreciation that when you talk about these things, whether it's, Jewish mysticism, whether you're talking about Hermeticism, you're talking about spiritualism, you are never trying to make the point that this is the answer, that we have it figured out, that this puts a cap, this puts a punctuation mark on this entire tradition. You're always, I think, making clear that, look, this is a piece of the pie, like you are here. And the more pieces of the pie that we have, the better. But we may not ever have all of them. That's okay. We can take a lot of enjoyment and fulfillment in just learning more and more, knowing we'll never reach any kind of point of perfect knowledge. So I just want to thank you for taking that approach. I think it's really productive.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I think it's just part of, I've learned over the years doing scholarship that intellectual humility pays the best dividends. Because when you write the book, The History of Something, you're going to definitely be wrong. But if you say, look, this is a piece of the puzzle, and I think it's an important one, and I'm uniquely, I get to be the mouthpiece for people like great scholars like James Stable and other people. I just get to popularize their message and add my own 2 cents, and scholarship moves forward. And that's ultimately what we all want. We want the scholarship to ask deeper, richer questions. And I don't think we're going to, history is another country. We're never going to fully explore that country. But the more that we can deepen and enrich the rich tapestry of that history, I think we're all the better for it. And also, the more that we come to realize that no one gets a monopoly on historical truth because no one has access to it. I think that's a powerful lesson for saying that before you get to make the claim and, put your flag down and say, now we go this way because history tells us. No one ever gets to do that without a whopping dose of faith.
Absolutely. Now, again, I want to thank you for coming on. I know you've been really busy over the last few months. You've been doing a lot of different projects related to your scholarship, related to your YouTube channel. Before we go, do you have anything that you want to plug or point people to?
Well, a few things. Unfortunately, I'm taking a trip to. It's unfortunate. I'm taking a couple of tours and a couple of trips to Egypt, but those are full. Unfortunately, there may be a couple spots left if folks really get excited about that. But I recently published a book with Dr. Dana Trell on some otherwise unknown works and the writings of Cornelius Agrippa, basically the guy who pioneered occult philosophy as we know it. We were lucky enough to get access to some of his otherwise untranslated works and translate those. What else I got going on? Luckily now I'm taking a little bit of a break from YouTube. I'm back on the horse next week. But what's the big thing? I have a new book catalog coming out. I'm a dealer in rare and antiquarian books. It's just funny having a book from the 16th century just sort of like arm's length away because I'm in the process of cataloging it and getting it ready for finding a new home for at least a few hundred years. And And then, yeah, I guess the other thing that I'm working on is I'm working with a ceramicist to remake Jewish incantation bowls for the first time. Incantation bowls were, as you may know, Drew, in the divorce between Christianity and Judaism, Christianity got exorcism, right? But Jews continued to
Yeah,
have to deal with
yeah.
demons like everybody else. And one of the ways that some Jews dealt with demons was by the use of incantation bowls, which many folks don't know outside of the Talmud. The incantation bowl literature is the largest Jewish literature of that time period. And so this is a enormously archaeologically important thing. And so at any rate, I work with a ceramicist to recreate brand new bowls. So I've translated a brand new incantation into Aramaic, and these are just neat art pieces. In terms of if you're interested in the history of demons and demonological literature, it's a lot cheaper than having to buy an antique one, and so they're pretty neat. We're gonna have those for offer here the next couple of weeks over on the channel. I'll be announcing that as well. So yeah, thanks for asking.
Make sure that you send me some links after this, and I'll put links to anything and everything that you send me
Sure.
down in the description. Once again, thank you so much for coming on, and good luck with all of your new adventures, both on YouTube and elsewhere.
Yeah, thank you, man. Thank you so much, and yeah, continued success on your channel. Love your content. Love watching the stuff you're doing with Dr. Laycock. It's just fantastic. So again, yeah, much success to both you and your partners on channels. You guys are doing great work, and I really appreciate it and I'm thankful for it.